Greetings. My name is Peter Beard with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I'm really pleased to welcome you today to our webinar series, Education Benefits That Work. Today's topic is around how we harness 529 savings plans to invest in building a competitive workforce. And while they've been around for a while, there have been some recent changes to help prepare students to enter the workforce, and we'll be getting to that shortly. But before we get started, we'd like to conduct a quick Slido poll to see how folks are feeling about their concerns about saving and paying for education. Please access the survey on your screen now via the QR code. This webinar series is to focus on education benefits to prepare our country's workforce for a dynamic economy. And one way to be thinking about this is through a virtuous cycle of education and skills. One way to think about it is really this better education and skills creates a higher caliber workforce that builds the strong business foundation that then helps create new businesses and job growth. So we increase the productivity and profitability, and it just is a virtuous cycle. And I'd now like to see the results of the Slido poll, if that's all right. So it seems to be the rising costs of tuition and the lack of disposable income and uncertainty about the education future. I also want to thank our partner, Third Sector, for sponsoring this webinar series. As a reminder, the Chamber Foundation's Talent Finance Initiative is focused on the importance of the public and private sectors working together to develop and use existing tools to finance our most pressing workforce challenges and opportunities, including how we support the rapid upskilling and reskilling of our workforce. In our last webinar, we explored the employer's role in helping finance education through provisions of Section 127 of the Internal Revenue Code. Today, we will be focused on the 529 college savings plans, which can help individuals and families pay for education. As we bring in our moderator, we'd like to conduct another quick Slido poll related to 529 college savings plans. Please access the survey once again on your screen now via the QR code, and please continue to answer the poll questions. And I'd now like to introduce Dr. Joy Coates, who serves as the Managing Director of Post-Secondary Opportunity at Third Sector. Welcome, Joy. We're letting our audience answer the poll questions. And in Joy's role, she partners with states, higher education institutions, employers, and community organizations to redesign funding and service delivery systems so that adult learners can access career-connected pathways. I'd like to take this opportunity to engage you in a brief conversation about why this work is so important. Let's quickly turn to the poll results. And on this first one, we see that a number of folks have a 529 plan. Does that surprise you, Joy?
You know, it doesn't. We hear a lot from the field that folks are aware of some of these programming, particularly 529s. But what we want to do, and I know that we're going to get to later today, is try to figure out who is really aware of these plans and what we can do to simplify not only the access, but the usability of these plans as a real tool towards adult learner affordability.
And isn't one of the other opportunities, Joy, to really think about how we can increase the economic mobility, prosperity, and security of families?
Yes, absolutely. I think that when we think about any type of savings vehicle, but of course today with the focus being on 529, I think that people are aware of them, but there's much more education that needs to be done, and there's much more. We are in a great moment where we can explore what the flexibility of these accounts really can mean for more people. It's we want to make it so that it becomes a more accessible tool for a broader reach of the public rather than a few folks. And we can only do that through education and through working with the very practitioners who understand these tools deeply and are already using them to support the populations that they serve.
And what do we need to be doing to help individuals understand the tools to obtain educations and skills? We've referenced this briefly, but you kind of have to know about these in order to access them, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, certainly, from third sector's perspective, we have a program that we are just now launching, which is known as the Lila's Design Lab. Lila, for those who may not be aware, is a lifelong learning account. And those are accounts like 529s that people can invest dollars into to be able to set aside money for tuition, to augment the cost of tuition, right? And so one of the things you can do, you can engage with a program like that, or a program like that of some of the folks we're going to hear from in a few minutes, and really plug in. We're looking at our nonprofits, our CBOs, and our IHEs to band together to help the people that they have direct access to, being the adult learner and community advocates within the community who also have access to those learners. We really need to do a better job of outreach and explaining what seems and can feel like really complex webs of administration that you have to go through to access these tools. So if we have adult learners who don't know what a 529 is, or we have folks who are serving adult learners who don't know what a 529 is, that's definitely part of the conversation that we get to have today, just that basic knowledge of what is it, then taking a step further and saying, okay, what kind of folks are serving adult learners? So we'll be able to hear from CEO from an organization in California that focuses primarily on adult learners, not only the cost of the education, but the wraparound services needed to remove barriers to completing education. And then the last piece that, colleagues like you and I in our respective organizations, the work we can do is galvanizing these organizations so that we can help partner with them to create better systems of education and sustainability for how to really maximize these programs as another tool in the toolkit for advancing economic mobility more broadly.
So let's see how our audience is familiar with these tools. So if we can quickly take a peek at some of the answers to their questions. So we see here the primary motivation that folks would do it obviously would be, contributions from an employer, but also the tax benefits. So there seems to be a greater understanding about the plan. And if we could go to the next one, let's take a peek and see whether they understand.
Okay.
So if you took a look at this, it looks like there's a lot going with the tuition.
But there is some flexibility.
Oh, there we go. They're beginning to answer them.
Let's give folk one more minute just in case we get anybody else to weigh in on others that they think maybe, okay. Okay. Yep. Okay. Books and supplies, maybe not. So we see that there is some varying knowledge of what they can be used for, and we know that that's in part because they used to be almost solely for tuition. We are now seeing expansion that does allow for K-12 tuition expenses, that does allow for some spending on supplies, which we'll get into momentarily. Childcare and daycare is a little bit of a gray area, and we'll rely on our experts to expound on us for how flexible that spending is. But this is what we actually would like as our ideal state, right, Peter? We'd like for this account to really be considerate of all of the factors that are necessary, all the enabling conditions we need to create for an adult learner to have success in the completion of their credential in order to achieve that economic mobility.
Yeah, and there was a trick one in there. Childcare, as I understand it, is not covered. So everything else on that list was covered. But as we do this, one of the things, as we think about the ROI on this, and we'll get to this, and you please ask the guest to that, is really around career guidance and counseling and coaching so people can help choose the right programs and pathways that yield a high ROI on this investment in education and skills. And I know we'll get to that, but I'll let you do that with our experts on that. So Joy, I really want to thank you on behalf of the Chamber Foundation for moderating today's panel. And I'm going to let you get to work.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter. And everyone, I'd like to introduce Leslie Crudele, who serves as the Government Relations Director for Commonwealth Savers, which is Virginia's college savings plan. Its mission is rooted in expanding financial empowerment for families, helping them prepare for future needs in new and impactful ways. Leslie also serves as the co-chair of the College Saving Plan Network's Federal Initiatives Committee, so has some insights into emerging trends and innovations and can help us get to some of those questions we had in the poll around what these plans can actually be used for. So Leslie, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us today. If you don't mind, I'd love to just go ahead and jump right in. Can you give us a little bit of the history around 529s, how they came about and what the current state is of these 529s?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be able to talk about 529s. And I was very impressed by some of those slide results, the knowledge that folks on this call have. So a little history lesson and just the Cliff Notes version. 529s actually haven't been around too long. They started about 30 years ago. And it really is something that kind of arose out of a need to address rising tuition, the cost of higher education, those traditional four-year degree pathways getting, a little bit more out of reach for a lot of American families. So back in 1996, legislation was passed at the federal level, creating Internal Revenue Code Section 529. So that's where the name comes from. It is in the tax code. We are a creature of the tax code. And that really kind of kicked this off, and it created these tax advantage savings plans for education. So essentially, very similar to what you see today with 529s. These were plans that were intended to help families make an investment in their child's future, make withdrawals for qualified education expenses when their child was ready to attend school, and those withdrawals would be tax advantaged. It's kind of interesting to watch the trajectory of 529 accounts over the years. When these first started, they were really kind of geared towards those traditional four-year education pathways. Looking, you all pegged it, tuition, that's your traditional kind of higher education expense that a lot of people think about, tuition, fees, things like that. But I think over the years, people have recognized that, hey, maybe that traditional pathway, isn't necessarily the only pathway for a lot of students or even the right pathway for a lot of students. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the most recent updates, but there have been updates over the past, 10, 15 years to try to make these accounts more accessible to more folks. So that includes expanding to allow your 529 to be used for things like laptops and peripheral equipment. That wasn't in the original legislation because that wasn't really a higher education expense when the bill was passed. Things like K-12 tuition. I know a few of you are aware of that one. That was an expansion that happened back in 2017 to allow families to use their 529s for up to $10,000 in K-12 tuition. Registered apprenticeships, expenses associated with that. That was also included in 2017. Student loan repayment up to $10,000 for the 529 account beneficiary or their sibling. Again, intended to just be flexible, because one of the things that we do here, even to this day, is people are worried about saving too much in a 529. We know the vast majority of folks with 529s aren't going to save enough to cover higher education expenses, but there's this fear that if my kid doesn't go to college, the money's locked in there, and then I'm going to have to pay a penalty to take a non-qualified withdrawal. So we've really, as an industry, heard that feedback and tried to make these accounts more flexible. And until the reconciliation bill, which passed earlier this year, which we'll talk more about, I think, the last change that 529s had undergone was this new rollover type, and it's a rollover of unused 529 funds from a 529 account to the Roth IRA of the beneficiary. So that was, again, intended to address that feedback that, I'm so worried my kid's going to have all this leftover money. What if they get a scholarship or, want to pursue a trade, and I've got all this money that I've been saving up because I'm a good parent, but I want to give my kid a head start. This was intended to address that. So again, you see an evolution over the years. And I think the biggest evolution happened in HR 1, the reconciliation bill. So we'll talk about that.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of can you share a little bit more detail about your work at Commonwealth Savers and how you and your colleagues are working to help Virginia families plan and save for their future expenses? You touched on it just a moment ago in terms of trying to dispel that fear that we're going to save too much, then we won't be able to access it. What are some of the strategies you use to dig a little deeper into that, to assuage that fear and to make it more clear how valuable these tools actually can be?
Yeah, absolutely. So Commonwealth Savers, we are a state agency. That's one of the fun little nuances of 529 plans is they do have to have a state sponsor. So we are Virginia state sponsor. Because we're a state agency, we're a very mission-driven organization. We really do take to heart the idea that we need to help prepare Virginia families, and we're a national program, so actually families across the country, to kind of know how to prepare for the cost of higher education, their options, if they think their kid isn't going to go to college, but maybe wants to pursue an apprenticeship or a credential program. Making sure that they're aware. So to do that, we have a really great marketing team in-house, and other states have similar marketing folks that, it's incredibly manual. They go out, they go to the PTA events, they go to the library events, they talk to families where they are, and just try to make it less overwhelming for them. And I think that's a really, really key piece of what we do is we educate families about the importance of saving, even if it's just a little. Over time, that adds up for most families. And so making sure that we're talking to them where they're at, helping it feel less overwhelming, making them feel empowered to take control of their financial future, that's really, really key for our organization. We also work really closely, and other states do as well, with local access programs. So making sure that, if we have revenue that we can put towards scholarship programs, we run a program called Source Scholars that gives away scholarships and 529 accounts for students at low-income schools. We do financial literacy programming, giving away financial literacy materials to schools. So that's another component of what we do. And I know our state agency and a lot of the other state programs as well try to team up with their sister agencies and their state governments to provide that financial education as well. So there's a lot to do.
And so in keeping with that education, obviously we put that poll up earlier intentionally to see, where folks, knowledge is in terms of what you can actually use 529s for. Certainly not, not childcare yet. There could be additional expansions. There could be folk like us who are trying to figure out, where are the edges that we can push just a little bit more to open up some of these enabling conditions. But would love for you to be able to talk us through your understanding of what this last round of expansions to 529 means in a little bit greater detail. And specifically, what can folk do now that they couldn't do? And what do you think that does in terms of potential greater adoption by a broader population?
Yeah, absolutely. So the latest expansion in the reconciliation bill, it's a little bit of a phased implementation approach. So we'll talk about the changes that went into effect immediately that folks are probably aware of. And these are effective for withdrawals made after July 4th of this year. And the first one is we expanded 529, so you can now use your 529 funds for recognized post-secondary credentials and credential programs and the expenses associated with them. So the key distinction there is you could use your 529 for a credential program prior to this change, but it had to be a credential program offered through a Title IV eligible educational institution. So that's essentially any school that qualifies for federal financial aid programming. That's your community colleges, your traditional universities. What that cut out was a lot of trade schools that aren't eligible to participate in the federal financial aid system. So this was intended to address that gap of we need to empower students to go pursue the credentials that they need in the workforce. I think it was a Bureau of Labor Statistics found that 40% of civilian jobs require some type of credential. So that's something that really spurred that need, was this gap that we were seeing in the market. So that's kind of the really, really big expansion that occurred as part of reconciliation. The other expansion was K-12. So before, you could only use your 529 for up to $10,000 in K-12 tuition, period. Now that is expanded to something a little bit broader. That's materials like curricula, books, testing fees, fees for dual enrollment, tutoring services. That is all expanded. That, again, already effective. January 1st, that actually will go up from $10,000 to $20,000. So that's something to just keep on your radar. But those changes were really, again, kind of spurred by the feedback that we've been hearing from families about that need for flexibility that you referenced earlier.
Excellent. And a little bit more on the outreach. Have you seen, I guess, because our hope anyhow is that there are folk online who are looking for some of those strategies in terms of, how do we get more people aware of this? Certainly, now that there's a double, the cap on the investment has been doubled, that certainly makes it attractive. But again, how do we make sure that people know about this? Do you think that this particular round of changes in your mind how much do you think this will impact the field in terms of the effectiveness, in terms of people really embracing these accounts?
Yeah, I think in particular, the credential component is going to be a really, really big change for our industry because it's kind of tapping into this employer nexus that, I'll be honest, it's been a little bit of a gray area for us as an industry. We're always trying to get employers engaged in helping their employees save. But now it's kind of a little bit, timely for employers to understand these changes because credentials and upskilling and reskilling, as was mentioned earlier, is valuable to them as an employer, and having their employees have access to credential programs and perhaps use their 529 savings to enable them to obtain those credentials is a big game changer. And just from an advocacy perspective on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, the coalition that supported the credential expansion in particular, was very, very multifaceted. And that was something that, was new for us to have the employer sector and the private sector kind of get a little bit more engaged on advocating for this change.
Okay, wonderful. Well, listen, we're going to bring you back in a little bit. Thank you so much for sharing what you've shared with us. We are already starting to see questions roll in, so not quite off the hook yet. And we look forward to being able to bring you back in with our next guest in just a few minutes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And so I'd like to invite to the conversation Ms. Sheila Thornton, who serves as the president and CEO of OneFuture Coachella Valley. Hello, Sheila. Sheila and I have already had the pleasure to meet, but I'm glad to be able to share her and her wisdom with those of you who have not met her yet. So just as a quick overview, One Coachella Valley focuses on ensuring that every student will achieve their academic and career dreams, contribute their gifts, and provide leadership to the future of Coachella Valley region. One of the primary programs, which we're going to be talking about today, is a Scholar Success Program that selects and awards scholarships for students from Coachella Valley. So welcome, Sheila, and I invite you to share a little bit more about the program before we dig deeper into the question. I think we can do a little bit of a double win here and hear a little bit more about the program, as well as just the history of OneFuture Coachella Valley and what it does.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me, Joy. It's a delight. OneFuture Coachella Valley really exists and was formed to align educational attainment goals with economic development goals. So it's about our belief that education really does lead to economic prosperity and economic mobility. And that in order for our economy to be a strong economy, we had to look at the places where students from the Coachella Valley, most of whom are in significantly low-income families, had the opportunities that they needed to be able to get into and through post-secondary programs and on into the workforce so that they can apply their gifts and talents and also get on the path out of poverty.
Mm-hmm. And so as we think about the conversation that we're nested in today, certainly 529s are the vehicle on the topic at hand, but certainly the broader thing we're really talking about here in some ways is what that means for affordability, right? And I know that you and your work, have many thoughts about this. And there's a lot of what you do is centered around not only what we mean by affordability in the most basic of senses, but affordability in terms of the barriers before our adult learners. So as you think about this 529 savings plan and how important it is for more people to have access of it, I wonder if you could speak to a little bit of your day-to-day experience supporting learners around these issues of affordability and what the benefit of a program for 529 could be for your specific learners, and then what you think also a gap may be, either in understanding or in flexibility in terms of it being an aid to their success.
I think you have to zoom out to understand that the conditions on the ground for students and families around pursuing higher education present obstacles that can feel pretty daunting if you don't have navigation. So from our perspective, OneFuture runs what's called the Regional Plan for College and Career Success. It's a big name for a region-wide effort where we bring together K-12 school districts, college partners, numerous nonprofit partners, and community organizations and employers on this cross-sector approach to understanding what the conditions look like for the students and families, expanding opportunity all along the way, and being proactive about educating students and families as to what their options are for support. So when I think about affordability, the one area of our work is really about our regional alignment of scholarship giving. And we specifically designed that as not just about the dollars, but about sort of the hook to get students into a system of support that is locally based, that's not just about one organization like OneFuture, but really is sort of networked throughout all of the organizations that they're going to be in touch with, and then assure that they have the kinds of resources they need beyond the money to be able to complete those degrees. Because persistence is an issue, first and second year, especially for low-income students. That is a key part of what we do. So we've actually aligned scholarship giving in a way where OneFuture gives dollars to students, but we also match it with 10 to 12, 15, depending on the year, other nonprofits and scholarship giving organizations. And those students apply to a common portal. They come into our system, and when they are awarded a scholarship, they then enter into a holistic support services program where one of the first things they do is they do one-on-one coaching with our counselors. And included in that is a financial aid package review. And you often think that that's going to happen at the college level, and to some degree it does. But when you're doing this one-on-one with students and looking at what their whole conditions are, including what their family's perspective is on it, how much they know about financial aid, it really is a driver of, I think, real improvement if those students have someone to help them navigate. And so that really is our focus is not just on the dollar amount, but it's about all the things that the conditions around how those dollars are spent, what available public financial aid there is, how well students are doing the appeals process to be able to get the money they need from the institutions, and then thinking about when you use the money, how well are we supporting that student so that they can actually finish that year and finish that degree and connect to a job.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about, first of all, there's so much in what you said, and I know I've got to keep one eye on the time, but I want to see if we can just crystallize one other piece. Can you dig a little deeper, give us a little bit more context when you're talking about the additional funds that you braid in addition to the scholarship funds and how that works? And in that context, do you see a place for something like a 529 as being an additional resource that you and your team might be able to leverage for your learners?
It absolutely is. So when students are in our program, once they've received a scholarship, you're doing this financial aid package review. We also included in the workshops that they receive. So for instance, every student under scholarship across the Coachella Valley, across all of our partners, they start off with a leadership conference in June, where they're learning about the financial aid, the academic resources, the mental wellness resources, career and college planning. And in that context, they are going to workshops around how they optimize their financial aid. So our approach is we want those students to get all of the available financial aid first, and then those philanthropic dollars are last in on scholarships. So we have financial institutions coming and doing workshops with families and parents, talking about the vehicles like CalKids and ScholarShare 529. And the students then have a sense of the fact that there are other vehicles available to them. But they also added to that, we're talking to them about assuring that they are applying for all available institutional aid, thinking about how they do financial planning for their own college journey, and what it looks like to assure that they don't get into too much debt that cripples them or derails their pathway. So the 529 plans absolutely have a role in this. I think probably the obstacle to it is simply awareness. When the student enters into the pathway, determines whether or not you're able to communicate what's available to them, and if they are entering in and haven't had the support they need, and their family isn't aware of the 529 option, you're behind the ball on that one.
Okay, well, we're getting ready to transition in just 1 minute, but would love to hear like a 1-minute success story, one of your favorite, most recent success stories from one of your learners at Coachella, that one Coachella.
I would say one of the greatest is a young woman who recently started her medical practice. She finished school as a naturopathic doctor. She came into our work probably 12, 15 years ago. And she was at the local community college and didn't have a whole lot of direction on where she was headed, and didn't have a lot of family support. And as a matter of fact, when we asked her the question about halfway through her journey, what would it take to, in high school, what do you think is the greatest obstacle for students completing the FAFSA just to get access to financial aid in the region? Her answer was, my parents didn't file taxes. So as a junior in high school, I had to learn to file taxes and then complete the FAFSA. So this young lady needed the support, got the financial aid support that she needed from us and others, got the navigation support, finished her community college degree, went on to the UC, and then finished her naturopathic physician degree last year, and opened a practice back in the Coachella Valley to serve the community. And that took a good 12 years of support and thinking and financial aid navigation to make that happen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sheila. I do believe we can now go ahead and bring Leslie back in. Let's see if the technology gods are with us, and they are. Fantastic. Okay, now if y'all will bear with me for one moment, it looks like we may have some questions in the chat. And this will be an interesting one. So, are employers able to contribute to someone's 529? Does the fund have to be assigned to a specific individual? So there's more than one question here. So let's slow down and just start with that first one, because I know that I personally am interested in that, and I'm sure many others are, in terms of the employer ability to contribute to a 529 and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So employers can contribute to an employee's 529 account. Anyone really can contribute to a 529 account. The distinction there is there could be some tax implications depending on the manner of the contribution, because that is an employer making that contribution. But no, they absolutely can. And a lot of employers do make those contributions for their employees.
Okay. Now, do we have to designate those funds for a specific individual, or what would that
Yes.
look like operationally? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, a 529 account is owned by the account owner, which generally is the parent, or in this case, it could be the employee. And then there's the beneficiary on the account. That's typically the student or the child of the account owner. But you can also name yourself as the beneficiary. So there could be a situation where there's a 529 account owned by an employee, name themselves as the beneficiary, and the employer makes contributions into that account, and that is absolutely completely okay.
Okay. So if you were to give advice, and Sheila, you may chime in here you may chime in too with some thoughts, is if we were to give an employer some specific recommendations, or even a region supported program, some recommendations on the best use of the 529 plan funds for the training, for apprenticeships, etc., where would we start with that? Because I don't believe, as we said earlier, I don't believe you were always able to pay for apprenticeships. And when we think about apprenticeships, we know that we certainly have to have the right level of employer engagement, first for the design of the program, then for receptivity and employment after the program. But what could that role look like for the financing of apprenticeships? And then Sheila, I'd ask you to think about the same question from your standpoints in terms of what you hear as a gap maybe in that practice, or what you hope to be able to see that employers are able to engage on that 529 standpoint. But Leslie, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the main thing is kind of understanding what's covered and what isn't is really, really important. So the apprenticeship expansion that occurred back in 2017, that's, expenses associated with that apprenticeship. So tools, that's not something that would typically be covered by a 529 in a traditional 4-year degree pathway. But making sure that your employee, or your apprentice, I should say, understands that it is a tool for them to cover those extra expenses that maybe aren't necessarily covered under the existing apprenticeship agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Joy, let me see if I can answer your question. I'm just going to zoom out again a little bit here. What came to mind with regard to this question of the employer role is what we talked about recently on another panel, and that is we are really looking at this point, thinking backwards from those high demand jobs in our region and what we might do to think about a co-investment structure. And we recently landed the plane on what we're calling an RN expansion pilot program. And it was the result of bringing together the executives of multiple healthcare organizations in the region who were feeling the real pinch of the RN shortage. And what we noted was there were really issues around capacity to be able to train RNs locally. Just fast forward, what the group did together was they established a common fund, a co-investment fund, to add 70 slots locally so that students on a wait list could get into those slots and they could accelerate the pace of their RN program. And it was a $3.4 million fund that came together. Where we're headed with that is thinking about a sustainability fund, something that is a co-investment structure where employers, philanthropy, students can all be a party to being able to pay for these things. And that's where I see the 529 component really as valuable for us to see that as part of the mix of how adult learners and students generally plan for the financial component of it, how employers can pitch into that. And I think what's needed there is we need to do the math for folks. We need to bring together a plan that says, here's what the total cost is for you to get X workforce out of this pipeline. And here are all the ways that we can sort of weave funding to be able to invest in that and not have it be a going back to the trough over and over again and say, okay, we need another $1 million. We need another, but rather a very proactive approach to being able to fund those positions that are most in demand and support students in a whole way, in a holistic way, understanding where their derailers are and what they need to do to be able to participate in 529 plans.
Mm-hmm. So how much of the onus do we think, in an ideal state, would fall on employers to engage in this process versus perhaps an intermediary organization like yours, Sheila, or the IHE themselves, in terms of, really kind of standardizing a best practice for how we can achieve this co-investment structure?
My answer is someone has to hold the common conversation, and if it's about just the education system doing one part of it, that's isolation. You'll get a particular approach to it. If it's just employers, they've all got so much on their plate that they can give only so much attention to this. But when you think about it, as we do with all the work that we do in the Coachella Valley, is what do we have? What's the issue that we have in common that we're trying to solve? And what is a common solution to that? And we're driving toward alignment of resources. So someone has to be holding that conversation, doing the translation, getting the math right to be able to say, this is what it's going to cost to make it happen. And then making sure that there's a level of dialogue that each of the entities is able to translate that into what then can I invest in this and where should I put priority in terms of financial support in order to get at that common outcome.
Mm-hmm. And Leslie, how readily available is the information on how these 529s can be implemented? Like, where can a family go and find more information on this? To Sheila's point, in terms of somebody holding the common knowledge, what are the gaps that you see in employer knowledge of this and their ability to even begin to step into the gap for not only adding some contribution financially, but also to promoting them for their employees or potential employees?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll say we have one full-time marketing employee, and that is all they do, is they reach out to businesses across the Commonwealth to just say, hey, did you even know this was an option? And, I was talking to her earlier in advance of this webinar. There is just not a lot of knowledge about these types of programs and the opportunities that they can provide as, even being just part of a benefits package. The employer doesn't actually have to take on any expense to be able to facilitate, information sharing with their employees. Here at Commonwealth Savers, we do webinars, outreach, we provide brochures, we go to benefits fairs. It's really that education component is, I think, the greatest role that an employer can play, because there's an element of trust there, that when you leverage that element of trust with the expertise of the 529 administrator, you've kind of got that comfort for the employees that, yes, this is a good idea. I think this is right for my family, and I'm going to go ahead and open a 529 for me or for my child.
Now, are employers able to offer payroll deductions for the 529 account? And how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is actually something that we are trying to really, really encourage folks to do, because we know every little bit helps. Little regular payroll contributions add up over time. And if you don't see it leave your paycheck, you don't miss it. So, in Virginia, even though we really do push it, and it is something that is available, it's just an ACH withdrawal that you can set up online in your account. Less than 1% of our accounts are funded by payroll deduction. So that is something that is a real opportunity, I think, again, for that education and employer component.
And so if less than 1%, the predominant funding comes from the students themselves or the families, some combination therein?
Families, yeah, making one-time contributions, ACH, just bank deposits every now and again. It's not that payroll nexus. That's kind of the clincher, is a lot of families will set up recurring contributions, but not out of their payroll, just out of their regular bank account.
And so when we think about this, I would ask you both, what other gaps do we see? Where else could we lean in terms of education and just engagement around these so that we can make them less mysterious, make them seem like they're not something for everyday use? Who else do we need to engage in the conversation to get broader adoption and awareness around these accounts so that they can be, so they can be maximized by more people?
Sheila, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that that learners, especially in a region like ours with the income levels, they are oftentimes in reactive mode about how they plan for their college and credentials, et cetera. And even those I'm thinking of healthcare alone, there are many learners within the healthcare system who would love to upskill. The question is always about how you're balancing your finances to be able to do the planning for that. So 529s are so much a prevention, but proactive, right? That there's got to be interaction at the K-12 level. There's got to be interaction at where somebody's beginning their college journey or even their entry level into any workforce. So I think you've got to be educating at almost every segment of the person's pipeline. And it needs to be families and students themselves, but employers, and there has to be, I think it has to be contextualized in a way that provides folks with, an opportunity to do some real financial planning around it, to understand what it takes to take something out of your paycheck to contribute to, your future career when you're in the midst of pretty significant stretch financially. I think that's something that we have to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Chiming in, I think that's spot on. The lifetime holistic financial education is something that I think is just absolutely going to be key. Here at Commonwealth Savers, we also run a state auto IRA program, which helps workers who don't have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. And, we do get that question of like, well, I can't do both. I can't save for both college and retirement, pick a lane. And I think that education, that, helping it feel a little less out of control over a longer time horizon helps make it feel less overwhelming for folks to get started. And that's just really going to be key.
Okay. Well, wonderful. If you can believe it, we are almost at time. I would invite you both for a quick parting thought before we close. Anything, if there was one thing, the question I always ask, and Sheila, you've seen me do this before, what is the one thing you hope people take away from today's conversation so that they can move a little bit further down the line and being engaged? What's one thing you want people to take away from today?
I'd say take responsibility as a collective for not just the financial path for students, but the whole path for students to getting the education training they need. And don't assume that it's going to happen in isolation in families or employers, et cetera. But, think about it in terms of a whole community and cross sector. When we're talking about these things, make sure that you prioritize the things that are going to have the most impact on those students, and that we can each take ownership from our particular lens.
Fantastic. Leslie, thoughts?
Yeah, I think in addition to that, which is a great thought, just really do listen to folks. I think the evolution of the 529 programs over the past 30 years has been the result of listening to our customers, listening to families, listening to employees about where the gaps really are. A lot of folks still think just traditional four-year education pathways are the only pathway. And we know it's not. And so I think that kind of evolution and constant feedback is really, really important to make sure that we're addressing the needs that are, just endemic in the modern workforce.
Well, thank you both. This is the second in a series of 3 connected webinars on education benefits that work. The first was on the tax code itself. Obviously, the 2 of you are in this fantastic one around 529s. And the next one, which will be announced shortly, is on skilled savings account, where we'll be able to talk about a bit of a marriage between the 2. Where are the dollars coming from? What would you spend them on? And what would it look like to have that information in an integrated place that the learners own and that they can use, to leverage for their own agency as they work with organizations like yours and mine and all the others in between. Thank you very much for everybody who joined us today. Thank you again to our panelists, Sheila and Leslie. Everyone have a great day.